So I'd like to introduce our guests for this afternoon. Let's start with a man who you would recognize by the products of his efforts. He's a documentary producer, director, and he has produced many documentaries. And these documentaries have been associated with celebrities, stars. Like, for example, the Cowspiracy, which is it's called a Cowspiracy, the Sustainability Secret, produced by Netflix, supported by Leonardo DiCaprio. And he also produced What the Health, which was produced by Joaquin Phoenix. So this is a man that associates with some very, very powerful people. And I have to say, when Heather looked at the various presentations that we had, she was most educated by this very practical talk by Keegan Kuhn. Mr. Kuhn, are you with us here?
Oh, I think I told him. Oh, here he is. Perfect.
Yeah, good. Hello there. You missed my introduction, but I tried to set you up as somebody who makes a difference in terms of what's going on the planet, with some really powerful messages delivered by some highly entertaining but thought-provoking and challenging documentaries. You must make a lot of people mad. What do you think?
Definitely push some buttons, but really it's opening up hearts and minds, and the response to the films has been phenomenal. So super grateful for everyone who has watched the films and made appropriate changes in their lifestyle.
Could you tell us a little bit about your motivation? I would guess you're in your middle age. I don't know whether you have a family or not, but what causes you to want to produce these documentaries that have changed the way people think around the world?
My motivation is I was raised with two rules, which was don't hurt anybody and question authority. And so that's how I've lived my life. And that don't hurt anybody means don't hurt anybody, humans, animals, ecosystems. And that's really my motivation for all these films. Cowspiracy looks at the environmental impact of raising animals for food on the planet. And so obviously that's hurting animals, it's hurting the planet. What the Health looks at the health implications of eating an animal-based diet on ourselves and on communities. So that's obviously about reducing harm. And all of my films kind of follow that same sort of message of living more compassionately, more peacefully, and more healthfully for all of us.
My guess is you live by another principle, a third principle, and that is to tell the truth.
Keegan,
and too many people
are... second. Is there any way you can turn your volume up? There's a few people in the chat that they can't hear you very well. Sorry.
Is that better?
You speak loudly through your documentaries, and certainly you get questioned a lot. So honesty must be a large part of your principles that keeps you going. Heather, can we start Keegan's presentation?
Sure, let's go.
Hi, my name is Keegan Kuhn. I'm the co-director of the documentary film Cowspiracy, the Sustainability Secret, as well as What the Health, Running for Good, and most recently, a film called They're Trying to Kill Us. This presentation is going to be an overview of the true impacts of animal agriculture on the planet. For those who haven't seen Cowspiracy, it's a feature-length documentary following my co-director Kip Anderson on a journey of discovery, finding out about the true impacts of animal agriculture, and posing the question why large environmental organizations are failing to address it. While making the film, we found that raising animals for food is responsible for a third of the world's freshwater consumption, occupies up to 45% of all ice-free land, is responsible for up to 91% of Amazon destruction. It's a leading cause of species extinction, ocean dead zones, and habitat destruction. Now, when it comes to environmental issues, a lot of the focus right now is on climate change, and that's great. It's finally starting to make headline news. But sadly, a lot of the information that we're seeing is misleading. We're seeing headlines like we have 12 years left to start dealing with climate change. And the reality is that that's not true. We don't have 12 years left to start dealing with climate change. We have 12 years left before we start seeing the most damaging impacts of climate change on our planet. We needed to be doing something 10, 15, 25, 30, 40, 100 years ago to stave off the most horrific aspects of climate change. Sadly, though, the conversation when it comes around climate change is things like drive less, that we need to use more efficient vehicles. And while driving less or using public transportation or using electric or hybrid vehicles is a good thing, it pales in comparison to animal agriculture. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, every car, truck, train, boat, plane combined, the entire transportation sector produces less greenhouse gases than the livestock industry, 13% versus 18%. Now, this figure has been revised and been dropped down to 14.5%. But even at that lower level, which many people have argued against, is still greater than the transportation sector. Other researchers have done their own analysis. Two environmental advisors for the World Bank did analysis of greenhouse gases using the global standard of measuring greenhouse gases, and found that when you take into consideration things like respiration, deforestation, the loss of carbon sinks, that animal agriculture is actually responsible for 51% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gases, all greenhouse gases coming out of human beings, making it the #1 cause of climate change. And the reason why there's such a big difference between this 51% and the United Nations percent is, one, the United Nations did not use the global standard for measuring greenhouse gases. And the other thing too is that it's how they measure the greenhouse gases. So CO2 is the main big name in climate change and greenhouse gases. And that gas has about a 100-year time frame. It lives in our atmosphere about 100 years. But there are more important or potentially more dangerous greenhouse gases like methane. Methane has a global warming potential 86 times greater than CO2 on a 20-year time frame. And the reason why it's important to make that distinction is that we could stop producing all fossil fuel emissions today, and we continue to see the world's temperatures increase for the next 100 years because the gas lives in our atmosphere for that long. Whereas if we were to cut emissions from methane, which is the vast majority of methane comes from animal agriculture, we would see marked temperature differences within a decade or two because it's a much shorter lived and more potent greenhouse gas. Another major gas is nitrous oxide, which is 298 times more potent than CO2. And 65% of nitrous oxide comes from animal agriculture. The other aspect too is looking at full life cycle analysis. You have to take into consideration things like respiration when we talk about the fact that there are literally billions, tens of billions of farm animals on the planet. Emissions from agriculture are projected to increase 80% by 2060 versus only about 20% for the energy sector. And the reason for this is that there's an increased demand for meat and dairy and egg consumption around the world, but also because the energy sector is shifting more and more towards green energy, which is a great thing. But if we don't change how we eat as a global society, there's no way we're going to stop the most horrific aspects of climate change. If we want to stop climate change, though, we need trees. But as I mentioned, 91% of all Amazon destruction is associated with animal agriculture. When we clear forests, we not only lose those forests, but we also lose the species that live there. So about 100 species go extinct every single day. That's plants, animals, and insects. When we talk about deforestation, palm oil gets a lot of attention. Palm oil is responsible for about 26 million acres being cleared. But if we compare that just to animal agriculture, and this is just animal agriculture in the Amazon, it's 136 million acres. And these are old figures. This is 2013. Sadly, the situation has only gotten worse. Palm oil, another part of that too, though, is that most of the world's palm oil is actually fed to livestock. When they clear forests, though, a lot of people think it's being cleared for timber. There's not a lot of money in timber. The vast majority of it is literally just burned to make room for livestock. And we're losing about an acre per second. That's a football field every second. And these numbers go even higher. And you think about that, every second a football field of forest being cleared just to make room for livestock. And it's not like you're putting hundreds of cows on that 1 acre, you're putting 1 cow or less per acre. Now, what they do in Amazonia directly impacts what we do here. Most of the beef raised in South America is exported to Europe and North America. What happens is they will burn the forest, they will run cattle, and because they're low organic levels in tropical soils, they become depleted very quickly. So after 1 season, they then plant GMO corn and soybean, which is then, of course, fed to livestock. Another major issue is about water consumption. In the United States, 5% of all water consumed is for domestic use versus 55% for animal agriculture. It is the #1 water consumption in the United States. And this is around the world as well. Fracking gets a lot of attention. Hydraulic fracturing for natural gas uses on average about 100 billion gallons of water every single year. But animal agriculture, and this is just the United States, and this is a conservative figure, consumes about 34 trillion gallons of water every single year. Pales in comparison. Everything pales in comparison to animal agriculture. If you look at the recommendations, for example, I lived in California for about a decade. We went through repeated droughts, and we would be told to take shorter showers, and that's great to save water. But just 1 quarter-pound burger is 660 gallons. That's the equivalent of about 2 months worth of showering. So you can have your 1 burger and skip 2 months of showering and save the amount of water. But it's not just meat, it's also dairy. Dairy consumes about 1,000 gallons of water for every gallon of liquid dairy. That's a global figure. You look at the water consumption saving recommendations, you can save about 47 gallons a day versus 660 gallons of water for just 1 burger. If you think about this on a visual way, imagine your neighbor watering his lawn, filling up his pool, and just letting the water run and run and run. And 660 gallons just running out into the street. And that's just for 1 burger. Every single person, every neighbor would come outside and say, hey, what are you doing? You got to stop. You got to turn that off. And yet this is what we do every single day with our diets if we choose to eat animal products. Water consumption is one major part of it, but another major part is water pollution. Animal agriculture is a leading cause of water pollution. And as I said in the beginning, it's the leading cause of dead zones. You have all of these factory farms, all these feedlots, and all of these fields of genetically modified and conventionally grown, chemically grown crops that are fed to livestock. Well, all of that nutrients washes off of those fields into streams, into creeks, into rivers that flow out into the ocean. And so you have these major areas that there's so much nutrients in the water that you have these massive algae blooms that literally pull all of the oxygen out of the water. So you'll have areas completely devoid of life. Fish can't live in there because there's no oxygen for the fish. And I've seen this for myself in North Carolina. Massive algae blooms happen because of the pig farms and the waste running off there, and literally seeing hundreds of thousands of fish floating on the surface trying to gasp to get enough air because there's no oxygen left in the water. This is something that happens around the world. Waste flows off and makes it out to the waterways. Cows produce about 150 billion gallons of methane per day and about 130 times more waste if you compare to the human beings. Virtually none of this goes through any sort of wastewater treatment. This is enough waste to cover every square inch of San Francisco, New York City, of Tokyo, Paris, New Delhi, Berlin, Hong Kong, London, Rio, Delaware, Bali, Costa Rica, Denmark combined. And this is every single year. There's an incredible amount of waste that we're not talking about. One dairy farm of 2,500 cows produces the same amount of waste as 411,000 people. That's about the size of Salt Lake City. The other aspect of animal agriculture is the fact that we are fishing the oceans to depletion. 3/4 of the world's fisheries, according to the United Nations, are now depleted, on the verge of depletion, or have already collapsed due to overfishing. And an important part of this is that the majority of fish pulled from the ocean and aquatic life pulled from the ocean is not fed to human beings, it's fed to livestock or domesticated animals. The way we fish the ocean, though, is with these massive trawler nets, which basically indiscriminately kill. They go after one species, but they catch every single whale, dolphin, sea turtle, all the megafauna that people seem to care about, because for whatever reason, people don't care about fish in the same sort of way. But if we were to think about doing this same sort of harvesting on, say, the African savanna, going after gazelle, but getting every single giraffe and elephant and lion and zebra, nobody would stand for it. Everyone say, this is insanity. We have to stop. And yet this is what we do every single day in the oceans. People say, well, that's just factory farming. That's the real issue. You know, we just have to change the way things we do. We should just eat grass-fed beef. But right now, half of the United States land is already used to grow livestock's feed or grass to feed those animals. If we wanted to switch over to meat, the US's demand for meat just with grass-fed beef, we'd have to clear every single square inch of the United States, all of Mexico, a good part of Canada, and about half of South America. But the reality is that most of this land isn't suited to grow grass. It's national forests, it's mountain ranges, it's national parks. It is land that is not suited to graze. But we would have to clear every single square inch just to make enough room to meet just the US's demand for beef. So clearly that's not a solution either. There has been this idea proposed by the regenerative agriculture movement that we could somehow use cows or livestock, grazing animals, to emulate nature and large herbivorous herd animals to be able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And this is very much pushed by Alan Savory, who gets funding from the livestock industry, but is also responsible for killing tens of thousands of elephants because he believed that they were causing damage. These are not trustworthy people that getting information from. But the reality is no matter how you graze livestock, they will never be able to sequester carbon better than a native forest. No matter how you graze livestock, they will never be able to sequester water better. They'll never be able to have the biodiversity that native forests will. They'll never be able to have the soil stability. There's nothing that works as well as a native ecosystem. You can't introduce an invasive species and think it's going to act the way a native ecosystem is or somehow work better. That is an unbelievable amount of human arrogance. This is probably the most important slide of my presentation. It comes from Dr. Sailesh Rao, climate healers at the University of Illinois, and they did their own analysis, finding that if you were to take the world's grasslands that were formerly forests and allow those forests to come back, forests that were cleared to make room for livestock, allow those forests to come back, you'd be able to sequester 265 gigatons of carbon from the Earth's atmosphere. That's more than the 240 gigatons that we've emitted since the industrial era began. We would be able to go back to a pre-industrial era in our atmosphere simply by getting rid of grass-fed livestock. Grass-fed livestock also is not only damaging to the planet, but there's also predator killing. Because animals are seen as a threat to the livestock industry, in the US every year, over 305 mountain lions are killed because they're seen as a threat to the calving industry. Over 322 wolves were killed. Bobcats are seen as a threat to the poultry industry, so they are also killed. But there's other species like crows that are killed. Fox are killed by the thousands because the livestock industry, sees these animals as competition or as a threat. And so when you have grass-fed livestock, that means that these predators aren't allowed to coexist with them. And the primary reason why this is happening is for grass-fed beef. So when you go to Whole Foods, you see the grass-fed, free-range, organic beef. Think about all the other animals that had to die to go along with it. This is also part of the United States rounds up wild horses on public lands because they are seen as a threat to the livestock industry as well because they eat the same things that cows do. So right now there are more wild horses in federal holding facilities than there are free on the range. They're spending tens of millions of dollars every single year to round up these animals and no environmental reason other than the financial request of the livestock industry. People will say, well, it's really an overpopulation issue. There's too many people on the planet. Human population is a major issue that needs to be addressed. And in 1812, there's 1 billion of us. 100 years later, there's 1.5 billion of us. And then 100 years after that, we skyrocketed all the way to 7 billion. And while that is an important figure to take into consideration, an even more important figure in my mind is the fact that there are over 70 billion farmed animals on the planet who need to eat, drink water, and have space to live every single day. The human population, being very generous, consumes about 5.2 billion gallons of water every single day and consumes 21 billion pounds of food. That's if everyone's eating. But the world's 1.5 billion cows alone, just cows, consume 45 billion gallons of water and drinking and 135 billion pounds of food. So yes, there is an overpopulation issue and it's a humans eating animals population issue. Over half of the world's grain is fed to livestock. A vegan takes about 1/6 of an acre to grow all the food they need for a year. A vegetarian who consumes dairy and eggs takes about 3 times as much land. And a heavy meat consuming, dairy consuming, egg consuming US American consumes about 18 times as much land to meet their dietary needs. And the reason for this is you can grow about 37,000 pounds of vegetables on an acre and a half of land versus only 375 pounds of meat on that same plot of land. raising plants is vastly more efficient and consuming those directly than raising plants to then feed to livestock. So why aren't we hearing about this from environmental organizations? Why isn't this the top focus issue? Part of it, I believe, is because of this man. This is Howard Lyman. He's a fourth-generation cattle rancher who was sued by a group of Texas cattlemen for food libel laws. He was on the Oprah Winfrey show talking about mad cow disease in the U.S. meat supply, and it had such an impact on the beef industry that their sales dropped. And a group of Texas cattlemen didn't like what he and Oprah said, and so they took them both to court and sued them. They ultimately won. Oprah and Lyman won, but this was a wake-up call to anyone who would ever speak ill against the cattle industry, that if they were willing to sue one of the most powerful people in media, Oprah Winfrey, then they would go after anyone. But there's also, we have a number of laws in the United States, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is a law that literally says anyone who damages or interferes with the operation of animal agriculture or animal enterprise is committing an act of terrorism. So that's anybody who rescues a chicken or documents the atrocities being committed is committing an act of terrorism. But the law is so loosely written that every vegan and vegetarian disrupts the profits and industry of an animal enterprise, and so technically is a terrorist under this law. But there's also a number of state laws, like the ag-gag laws, which are anti-whistleblower laws that were created and pushed through by the industry to silence people exposing what's going on. So you can be on a public street or in the air documenting the atrocities being committed against animals, workers, or the environment by this industry and be charged under these laws. But there is something you can do, obviously. By switching from meat to plants, you use 16 times less land, use 13 times less water, 11 times less oil, reduce your emissions by 50%. That's simply just from switching from eating animals to plants. Every single day, to put that into perspective, that's 1,100 gallons of water that you save, 30 square feet of forested land, 45 pounds of grain, and the equivalent of 20 pounds of CO2 every single day. And then obviously there's the animals. And that's a huge part of this, is that we are just one of millions of species on this planet. And we have to get away from this human-centric idea of ecology, that this planet is not just for us, that we share it with literally billions of other individuals, and that their interests and their desires are of value. And so to take in consideration the animals' lives and their desires, even if somehow magically raising animals for food was somehow sustainable and wasn't this incredibly destructive, most destructive industry on the planet, it would still not be ethically acceptable in my eyes to kill and consume and enslave and torture non-human animals. If you want more information or you want facts and statistics or sources for this presentation, you can go to Cowspiracy.com. We have an entire fact page. And again, I encourage you to watch the film either there or on Netflix. I want to thank McDougall for inviting me to be part of this and for all the other presentators. Thanks so much.
How often do people come up to you and say, well, I believe what you have to say. I've seen it. I've seen the forest fires. As a matter of fact, we happen to be one of the unlucky families, and Heather was also, who was burnt out in the October 2017 wildfires. So we realize it's true, but it seems like no one or very few people are directed towards fixing the problem. What do you think we have to do?
I think that it's about having an informed population. People can't make informed decisions unless they have all of the information. And this information has been intentionally hidden. It's been intentionally squashed in whatever regard possible. Anytime anybody would bring this up on the news, for example, they always had to have a industry person to back up their side of it. So it's an intentional to try and keep this quiet. But I think what will change is when everybody starts waking up, which is happening. People are waking up and people are raising their voices and they're saying enough is enough. And you can't really talk about meat now as an environmentalist and not bring up the fact that it's one of the most destructive industries on the planet, if not the most destructive industry on the planet. So I see things progressing really quickly. Obviously, climate change is progressing really quickly, but people are realizing that we have to do more than switching our light bulbs and turning the water off when we brush our teeth. It's got to be actual lifestyle changes.
Well, the truth is coming out. I mean, myself as a medical doctor, I find it necessary to have my patients understand that they're not going to have any risk of protein deficiency, and starches are not fattening. There's never been a case of dietary protein or dietary calcium deficiency ever reported. Let's talk about the fish for a minute. You know, if I mention the fish, you think of the nutrient omega-3 fats. But most people don't understand that omega-3 fats can only be produced by plants. Only plants can desaturate at the carbon-3 position. So the message should be you go to plants, but instead people are justifying the destruction of the oceans. And I have to tell you, Keegan, the oceans are one of the greatest loves of my life. I'm a big boat sailor, windsurfer, scuba diver, swimmer. You know, the ocean has been so important to me. As a matter of fact, I'd have to say if I had to pick one part of the environment to save, it would be to save the oceans for my children and grandchildren to see the beauty. And when I first started getting involved in the oceans, when I was 5 years old, there were a lot of fish around. But today, the figures I've heard is 90% of the large fish are gone. So, you know, we have to take action or it's going to get to the point where the oceans become unrecoverable. The other thing that kind of disturbs me and that I feel helpless in is this what's going on in the Amazon. You know, you have all of these people who need to support their families, and that's how they justify destroying the rainforests. But it seems so difficult because we're not in that part of the world. Most of us don't live there, and there's so much political turmoil. How do you think there's any chance to save the oceans? I mean, give me some hints, and to save the Amazon. That seems like two great areas of ecology that we should focus our attention on.
Yeah, so saving the oceans absolutely should be foremost. It is the largest carbon sink on the planet, more than forests. It produces more oxygen than the world's rainforest. So absolutely saving the oceans. And the first thing that you would do to save the oceans is stop pulling animals out of it. When you remove fish, you know, the literal trillions of tons of life from the oceans, you're pulling all that carbon out too. But it affects the entire carbon cycle of algae. So the ocean can't sequester carbon in the same way. It doesn't regulate in the same way. So the planet heats up even faster. And it's the same thing with the world's rainforest. The vast majority of the rainforest destruction that's happening in Amazonia, for example, is not done by impoverished people. It's done by major corporations. It's done by companies like Cargill, who have these massive contracts. So there is a level of rainforest destruction that's happening from subsistence farmers, and those are very small scale operations. I mean, we're talking about maybe 10 acres versus the tens of thousands of acres that are cleared by these mega corporations, US corporations for the most part. And so the demand for beef in particular in the North America and Europe is what's driving that deforestation. So if people in the West stopped eating those animals, there would not be as much demand for it, and therefore they wouldn't be destroying the forest for that reason. Those are the two biggest things. I mean, really, though, the world's oceans, they will recover if we just stop taking animals from them. When we've seen that, when we go into areas that have biological reserves in the ocean, that have stopped fishing entirely, it's incredible how quickly the ecosystems recover. The animals come back so quickly. And so we could see that around the world. There are obviously indigenous communities who depend upon sea life for their sustenance and for their survival. But those, again, are tiny fractions of the human population. They are not devastating the world's ocean. They don't have massive trawler nets. We have to stop how we eat, particularly in this country.
Well, I have a little hope that industry, the people who are involved in making money off the food industry and the medical industries, are going to straighten around their moral compass and do the right thing. It just doesn't seem the nature of human beings to do the right thing. Profit always seems to rule. So other than all of us as individuals making changes, adopting our diet, trying to educate our friends and relatives, what else can we do? How can we get people to exercise the political will to save our home?
Yeah. I mean, if people feel moved by and believe in the political system and getting the lobbyists out of our government, getting the money out of our government and actually having true politicians who represent us as the people versus corporations, that would be one step. The I believe it's $34 billion that the livestock industry receives in federal subsidies every year would make it a lot easier for people and for the environment to recover. So those are a few things, but it's big business, it's big money, and that's the reason why we're not hearing about this conversation. And the reason why it continues is because people are making a lot of money off of it. But it's a select small group of people. This isn't like an industry that's employing hundreds of millions of people around the world. This is a relatively small automated industry, small population of people who are profiting from it. So the vast majority of us aren't profiting from animal agriculture, and therefore we don't have a financial stake in it. And so we should reject it at all costs.
So I heard you talk about how methane, which is primarily from the livestock industry, is a very potent greenhouse warming gas. But I always understood that even though the methane may last 10, 12 or more years, not too many more, that it's broken down into carbon dioxide, which does last 100 years. Is there something I'm missing in the equation?
Yeah, so it's when the carbon molecules break apart, what causes the most heat versus if you compare carbon dioxide versus methane, which methane is a carbon molecule, the true heating impacts of it are coming from methane. So when you remove methane from the atmosphere, you would see incredible marked difference. And again, this is something that we see immediately. And that's a big part of the climate change discussion, especially when they talk about timelines, is that we don't really have 100 years to deal with climate change. It's like that we have to stop producing fossil fuels. Obviously, that's a major driver. But if we don't stop the animal agriculture element of this, that's it. And that's the other thing too, is that by stopping animal agriculture, reducing methane and nitrous oxide production into the atmosphere, it buys us the time needed to deal with the larger CO2 problem.
Yeah, well, let me kind of emphasize this fact that with our change, our personal change in diet, we are giving ourselves extra time to develop technology for transportation so that everybody can own an electric car. I guess that's one way to go, even though some of our guests this morning talked about even more revolutions in the transportation industry. So yeah, even if we give the planet another day, even if we can slow this down enough by our individual actions so that technology can catch up, that's well worth doing. And what's the sacrifice? Good grief. I've been taking care of people for almost 50 years. And I've taken care of 12,000 patients personally. And they are so impressed not only with the benefits in their personal life, the weight loss, the reversal of artery disease, the disappearance of diabetes and high blood pressure. They are so impressed with how powerful a dietary change is in their individual life. And the other thing I've found my patients, people I've been involved with, are so impressed by is how good the food tastes. I mean, animal foods are disgusting at worst and bland at best. And the only way that most people can eat them is to cover them up with ketchup and steak sauce and sweet and sour sauce. But we're giving up disgusting food. It's destroying our home. What would you like to see people eat?
I'd like to see people eat very basic whole foods, eat grains. I don't know. There's a famous MD who promotes eating a lot of potatoes. That's a great way. That's a great thing. You look at the carbon footprint of potatoes versus beef, for example, or the water footprint. It takes 2,500 gallons of water to produce a pound of beef, but it only takes about 60 gallons of water to produce a pound of potatoes. So it's just that alone. No other lifestyle comes anywhere close to switching your diet to a plant-based diet. Then you could drive an electric car, put solar panels on your house, do rainwater catchment. You're still not going to have as much of an environmental savings as switching to a plant-based diet. Then there's all the health benefits, obviously, and there's all the cost benefits. There's all the ethical benefits of not harming other beings needlessly. So, really, there's nothing that comes close to switching our diet to a whole foods plant-based diet.
Well, you should be hearing from Keegan that there's no downside to this. There's every reason to do it. We just need to develop the will, those of us who know the will to change the planet and save the planet. Do you have some questions from our listening audience, Heather?
So, something that's come up a few times in the chat and questions is a documentary called Kiss the Ground about regenerative farming. Can you talk about that? Is it not to be trusted? What's your
Yeah.
opinion on it?
Yeah, so there's this whole movement now of regenerative agriculture, and it's really good marketing, and it's about how soil health is paramount. And I agree, soil, my background actually before being a filmmaker, I spent over a decade as an organic farm developer. I developed small scale organic farms, and soil health is absolutely essential. The marketing though of grazing livestock to somehow sequester carbon into the soil ignores the entire carbon cycle. So for example, right now we've got 70 to 80 billion farmed animals on the planet who breathe every single day, and their carbon dioxide ends up in their atmosphere, and people would say, oh, well, that's just part of the natural carbon cycle. But because we've exceeded our current carrying capacity of the planet by a magnitude of 7, there's 7 to 10 times more animals on the planet now in biomass than have ever existed, more than dinosaurs, any other time in Earth history. So the amount that these animals, because they're artificially bred and they're fed for the vast majority, chemically grown, artificially grown plants, their respiration, by the time we hit a neutral where the plants are absorbing all the carbon that they're breathing out, we would cook the planet. And so that's a big one. That's just to start with, that the regenerative movement ignores, is that the amount of animals we have on the planet right now. But the other aspect of it too is that you can have people who are looking at the regenerative movement and they're very focused on, for example, bacteria in the soil. And it's true, if you have a bunch of grazing animals consuming and defecating on that land, the biodiversity of the soil will go up dramatically, and that's great. But it ignores the fact that the biodiversity above the soil. So as I mentioned in my presentation, you put cows on land, you've just removed all the deer, all the elk, all the moose, all the other grazing animals, the other ungulates that would be naturally there. You remove the native forest, you remove all the predators. So the loss of biodiversity is incredibly damaging. But again, if you compare, and you see this with medical studies as well, you compare the really bad factory farming and how bad it looks, and then you put the not as bad regenerative grazing next to it, it looks like the solution. But then you take away that and you look at just veganic agriculture or native ecosystem, and it looks really good. And so that's the big part of that Kiss the Ground was missing, is that regenerative grazing is not the solution. If it is the solution, then we should have native species be doing that. So a lot of regenerative farmers would say, oh, well, we're mimicking what the bison would do. Well, then put the bison back. But you can't market bison flesh in the same way you can market cow flesh. And so there's not as much money in it. And so it really just shows that this is not about ecology. This is about money for these people. And so the reality is, if you want to protect the planet, you got to protect the animals. And that means all the animals.
You may feel hopeless, but you have the individual opportunity to change what you eat tonight for dinner, tomorrow morning for breakfast. So it's not hopeless. I've been at this for 74 years, and I've been aware for probably 50 years about the importance of a healthy diet in terms of the health of human beings. And I've been very acutely aware of the effect of diet on the planet ever since my first grandchild was born 17 years ago. He's driving a car now. So things happen quickly, and information, of course, is the key. Other questions we have, Heather?
So a question about moderation. Can we just cut back on our fish and meat intake, or do we have to go entirely vegan?
Yeah. So the Meatless Mondays idea that was really popular 10 years ago, that's the more moderate idea. The reality is, and the sad reality is, that we don't have a long enough timeline for people to just cut back. We actually need to go 100%. There is no moderation in this. And people want baby steps, but as Dr. Openlander says, we're not babies. We're big people. We can make big people steps. And so just to realize that there is nothing that's going to improve the planet better, or your health, or your ethics, than switching to a whole foods plant-based diet. There's just nothing's going to do it. And so sadly, moderation is not the solution. Of course, if people feel like they have no other option but cut back, that's great. That's a step in the right direction, but it's a small step when we really need to take big people steps.
You're a young man. And as I say, I don't know your family situation, but you must have thought about the next 50 years. What do you think? Is there any hope? And what is it going to take to get people oriented in the right direction? Give us a little hope.
All right. it's not my forte, but I've been vegetarian my entire life, and I've been vegan for the last 24. And in the last 24 years, I have seen not only just the number of vegans increase dramatically, an exponential increase in the last few years, but I've seen the culture starting to look at how we consume animals in a whole nother way. And so I really do see that, we're going to see a vegan planet, or we're not going to see a planet at all. And so that's what I focus on, is the fact that this is the only way out of the situation we're in. And so when push comes to shove, people change. We can also look at, the history. Again, you're an expert on this. Look at the history of human population and human civilization. We historically ate a predominantly plant-based diet around the world. And so we can go back. It's only in the more recent times that we've eaten these crazy high amounts of animal protein. And so we can go back to a more sustainable, more ethical, a more health promoting way of living. So I see that as the future, because there is no other future.
Yeah, the planet destroying Western diet is basically a fad. It's been around for 50 to 100 years and large numbers of followers. Prior to that, it was the kings and queens of old, and they certainly suffered obesity, gout, diabetes, but nothing new, except for the number of people who live like kings and queens and aristocrats. Right. Over half the planet has come to the understanding that it's their birthright to eat like the richest people in the world. And they've made changes so that diseases of overnutrition far exceed diseases of undernutrition. Anything else for Keegan?
I don't think so.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We'll join with you in about an hour and have your input. I appreciate what you had to say very much. As I said, Heather found your presentation most entertaining, but probably a little frightening. What do you think, Heather?
Yeah, it made me think, especially the whole grass-fed beef, because that's what so many people say. I eat grass-fed beef, it's fine, but reading, it's just not sustainable. None of this is sustainable. So thank you for putting that all out there, Keegan.
Thank you. Appreciate it.